Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Virtual Vilna. I'm Marilyn O'Connor, and I'm president of the board of the Vilna Shoal, and I'm so happy to have you here with us this evening. This is our third in a three-part series, and it's been very, very interesting, and I know that we have a lot to talk about. We're going to try and really conclude the session with some great ideas as to how we can move forward. And so I'd like to just thank everybody for coming. Thank you for being part of this. Thank you for all our partners, our community partners. Clearly, there is an interest and a need. People are hungry to learn more about how they can help. So check out our website for bios for all our speakers. Special thank you to Andy Tarsy, who has been really the person that has brought us all together. And I hope that tonight, or rather this series, is just the beginning for the Vilna as we strive to really make a difference and enhance and strengthen the entire Boston community. So Andy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Marilyn. I'm going to invite our guests to unmute and turn on video as well. And welcome back to the program, Nia Evans, director of the Boston Ujima Project and master of many trades and traits. Unmute yourself, Nia, so we can bring your voice right in if you can. But most of which I would say is vision, because she sees something that is going to take a while to become, but the patience and the diligence about imagining something better around these questions of racial injustice, economic injustice. So welcome back, Nia. Good to be with you anywhere, but especially here.
Thank you, Andy.
And Deborah Frieze. Get that mute off so we know, unless you're muting the dog, or somebody doing something. Yep. All right. But again, an inspiration, a source of knowledge, someone who will tell truths about things that aren't that comfortable to hear about ourselves when we know we can do better, and someone who's ready to be a partner and put good intentions to use. Is that a fair statement about your work, Deborah?
Absolutely. Thanks, Andy. Well, good
awesome.
To be here.
Well, we've got that in spades. And so what we want to do tonight is synthesize. I can't tell by the scores of folks that are on with us tonight how many have been on with us for the first two. But all together, we've had hundreds of people involved in the conversation. And we're going to reference some things we've talked about over two sessions. And if it sounds like there's an in-group here and you're not part of it, it isn't. It's just that we are performing live without a net, and we'll catch you up. But there are some things we've talked about in this conversation that I want to get into in some more depth tonight, and really bring us to a place where we've made great use of the time of these incredible guests, but not some artificial landing spot. This is a process. And all we're doing is opening doors. You got to go through them and do the stuff. So, but I want to go back to a theme we started with, which is we want to become better allies, not because we have it made and someone else needs help, but because a norm of good human behavior is to be of use to others and to be in service of values that we share, where it's good for us too. Remember, we are all robbed by inequity. It's not just the person on the short end of the stick. The whole thing is diminished. The quality of our all lives are destroyed by pain that is being experienced by others. Now it's different, but it's very real, and it's all been diminished by our ignorance and our mistakes, and by the policies and structures that good allies are now getting serious about owning and dismantling. And so being better allies, dismantling structures and systems, not just sort of having strive harder with the same old tools. These are some themes that we've been talking about, and I threw out a template: knowledge, skills, and attitudes, which we steal from the academy around education. which is to say any good course is trying to teach you new knowledge, new skills, and to inculcate in you some kind of an attitude. So I keep asking our guests, what knowledge do I need to be of greater use, to be a better ally? What skills ought I be developing? And what's the attitude? What's the disposition in showing up? Remember, I mentioned Woody Allen, not necessarily the best, icon for this conversation, but the idea that he said, 80% of life is showing up. Fine, but what's the other 20? What do I need to have with me? What do I need to have figured out? And then for those of you who are coming to this conversation from organizations, there's some synagogue social justice committees and racial justice committees represented, and churches hopefully too, and other civic organizations, folks in the Vilna organization itself. What does a toolkit look like to set us up to be present as an organization? What does it mean for us to be in relationship? And I keep using this like poker analogy, which I don't play poker. I don't know much about it at all, but I keep sort of saying, I see you this and I raise you that. So like to Temple Beth Elohim in Wellesley, and I know some of the leadership of their racial justice program are here tonight. They're doing all kinds of work. And I would want to give them compliments. And then but I would also want to say to them, I see you had a great 2019 and 2020, but I'm going to raise you what's next. So I want to hear even from the, it's like someone once told me I needed a coach, which I did. And they said, don't feel bad. Olympic athletes have coaches. So if we're saying do more, it's not because you're not doing a lot. It's because we got to know what's required, what's required of us. So we're pushing everybody. Please put questions right into the chat. We're going to mix them right into the stew tonight for lots of points of view. All right, so that's my opener. Two things I want to do really well tonight with our hour. One is listen. So I'm going to be asking a lot from you, Deborah and Nia, and the other is get practical with people who have questions. We promise you a resource guide and a toolkit that will come out to everybody afterward, but we're not done building it yet. We need more content. So share some links, share some stuff, videos, articles, everything else. All right. So that's it for starters. Nia, first of all, how are you? Did you have a good week?
Last week. Did I have a good week last week, Andy?
Since we last saw you here, have you had a good week?
Ooh, I believe I did. I honestly don't remember the rest of the week. That's just how every week goes. But I do believe I had a good week. I definitely had a good Sunday. That much I can remember.
Okay, good.
I had a good Sunday.
And how about you, Deborah?
Well, I mean, what can I say? It was Hanukkah, right? So I made latkes and invited friends to have them in the fire pit out back. So that was a new kind of Hanukkah. And I also attended a great evening that Nia was hosting for the Ujima project when she had their first investment, telling us all about how they did. So that happened, Nia, to you last week, and it was great.
Yeah, Nia, we're going to have to work with you.
It did, Deborah. Thank you. And I appreciate that, Deborah.
We're going to have to work with you.
I know. And actually, when we were talking about today.
Go ahead.
What's happening right now is my network bandwidth is low. So there may be a bit of a delay. Hopefully it won't keep up for the rest of the night. But yeah.
Well, you forgot about something really big that happened on Wednesday night. And one of the things you invited all of us to in the future is Wednesday nights are a big Ujima gathering night. And even though we want everybody to have all these great skills and knowledge, you basically said, come one, come all, just come humble and listener oriented. And Wednesday nights, they talk about stuff and people meet people. And but you had something a little bit different last Wednesday, which was quite on point. You had, as Deborah just mentioned, a presentation from one of your key investments. Tell us more about what happened.
Thank you, Andy. And again, please excuse, I think there's probably a delay happening. But yeah, so we were talking about this. I actually should have mentioned this last week. I should have invited everyone here last week. So I am actually curious if anyone did show up. So if you did pop by Ujima Wednesday, if you could just drop it in the chat, that'd be cool. That'd be neat to see. But yeah, as Deborah said, we actually had our first investment report out. So one thing that we are doing is businesses that we invest in as a part of really ensuring that our process is community centered. Our investees understand that they will have at least one annual conversation with our members. And this is an opportunity for them to talk with our members about the impact of the investment on their business, whatever they can say up until that point, challenges, successes, ways that members can be helpful, lessons learned. So we really try to, for us, I think one thing that we do that is neat is providing these opportunities for our community members and for businesses to, I would say be in a relationship with each other than what's traditional. So it goes beyond seller, customer, it goes beyond what could maybe be antagonistic depending on the business and depending on the history. Also allowing that there's some relationships we have with our favorite businesses that are great, but it allows, I would say, the business and our community members to really relate to each other more intimately and just in a different way. And it allows opportunities for our businesses and for community members to be to problem solve together, so that businesses understand they have a network with them. Yeah.
Quick question coming from folks in particular who weren't with us last week. There might have been something else going on in the world. I don't know why anyone wouldn't have been on every one of these sessions, but how do you sign up to come on Wednesdays? Is there a link? Is there a process if I wanted to come to one of those in the future?
Yep. Yep, thank you. And thank you, Amy, for asking. If you are, yeah, it was Amy who asked. If you sign up for our mailing list, we send an email out every week. And every week in that email, it's a varying length. One is much longer. It's called the wire or the list, depending on which list you're on. And then alternating weeks, they're much shorter. Every email has a section that will talk about the previous week's meeting. So what we do is we provide written notes and we provide a video of the meeting so that anyone who can't join us at that particular day and time can still check it out later. And we also include that night's meeting topic, guests, if there are any presenters, and in that email is the Zoom link. It's the same Zoom link. I can put it in the chat now. It isn't useful until it's actually Ujima Project Zoom, until it's actually time for the meeting. But again, it's in our email every week. And I've just put in the link, it's tinyurl.com/Boston Ujima Project Zoom. And if you go that takes you to a registration page for our regular Ujima Wednesdays.
All right, and is there a
Ujima's email? So if you go, yep, if you go to ujimaboston.com and join our mailing list, that's how you get on our mailing list. And there's a bit of a manual process. So what we actually do, so it'll probably take about a week's time. What we actually do is we check the mailbox of that website, and then we add you to our CRM. And once you're in our CRM, you're set up for regular communication from us. You're welcome, Sandy.
So Andy, I want to go back to what Nia was talking about with the company that was presenting and just like reflect a little bit on that, because what's so unusual about that, that Ujima does, that we do, that other finance groups that are rooted in the grassroots and organizing and community, is if you look at normal conventional investing, there isn't a direct relationship between the investor and the underlying investment, especially in public markets, right? But so investing is generally anonymous, opaque, right? And transactional. So you're putting money into something, and way many degrees away is the underlying investment, the company, especially if you're in a fund. And so what's going from anonymous, opaque, and transactional, we're talking to direct, personal, and transparent, where there's a direct relationship between the investor and the company. It's personal, right? And the movement of capital and flows is transparent. That is the opposite of the way, if any of us look inside our conventional investment portfolios, you're going to see, like, you don't have any relationship with, you may know the brand, but you don't actually know the company and they don't know you. And so that's part of what we're trying to undo by coming into relationship where it's like, I'm not just an investor in the company. I could be a buyer. I could be, in the case of the company that Nia was talking about, they did an incredible job with a campaign, a consumer campaign, to help this company, which is a business to business company, secure a customer, a business customer. So it's really shifting. And what makes that possible is being place-based, is having local people investing in local companies that matter in their local economy.
So a couple of things I want to just ask you to clarify, and then I'm going to take this a step further in the conversation that we're trying to have, the bigger conversation. But tell us again who the company was. I know, but some folks weren't with us last week, and it's actually relevant to those who were with us. Nia, tell us who it was and what they do.
Yeah. The company is Federal Co-op, and I'm also putting it in the chat, and I believe you can find them at federal.coop. It's a worker-owned composting co-op, worker-owned by Black and Latinx workers. Right now, there are 3 worker owners, all women. And the story, and actually I didn't get to tell this the first time because I was trying to be mindful of time, but I think this is probably, if it's worthwhile, maybe something that Deborah and I can tell together, just by way of just really practical example of our work. But the story of Federal's creation is a story that I often tell as an origin story of Ujima, really to kind of highlight the way we bring stakeholders together and the way we bring different types of money together. And BII is a part of that story. So I don't know if you think it's a good idea, Deborah,
Do it.
to start telling that story.
Go for it.
You want me to go for it? Okay. All right. I'm kind of paranoid about my internet connection because I just keep seeing your net worth bandwidth is low. But all right, so I'm gonna go for it. So let's see. So this is, and definitely just kind of jump in where I need to be corrected on some stuff. So I want to say 2013, 2014. And I'm definitely going to be kind of just like adding, I guess, layers onto this story. So one is there's a gentleman named Aaron Tanaka. I don't know, definitely Andy knows Aaron, Debbie knows Aaron. Deborah, actually I don't ever call you Debbie, I just did that. Yeah. But Deborah knows Aaron. I don't know if other people on the on the panel know Aaron, or if anyone in the audience knows Aaron. But Aaron Tanaka is the person to whom I attribute Ujima. So I say that Ujima is his brainchild. He was the ED of Boston Workers Alliance, which was an organization that's now defunct, but at the time was working to help reintegrate people returning home from incarceration. It was a member-based organization, so it was a membership organization, which it's just something I want to highlight. That's important. Ujima is a membership-based organization. And so I think there's a paradigm and a history to membership organizations that I think it's also just important to hold in this work. And one of the ways they tried to help people reintegrate was via employment. They had a staffing agency, and they were also notable for helping to lead a coalition that helped to bring about ban the box legislation in Massachusetts. So because of their efforts, Massachusetts was the second state in the nation to pass ban the box legislation. Ban the box legislation says employers cannot ask about an employee's criminal history at certain points of the employment application process. And so that's huge. big victory. People saw a lot of changes happening in the wake of that victory. People kind of saw huge stigma, discrimination, barriers kind of melting away. It didn't happen that way. So I think there's another note here, and I know in my background conversations with Andy, for example, this is one of the things that drives him with the type of work that he does, is kind of understanding the power and the promise of legislation and also the limitation of legislation at the same time. So I think this example is a bit indicative of that. And just when we think about what are the different types of work we should be doing to bring about change. And so, as with any legislation, there are loopholes that some you can foresee, some you cannot. One of those was that there were other ways and had been accounted for in the legislation for people to acquire one's criminal record. The members at that point basically said, we want to take our fate into our own hands. We no longer want to be at the mercy of employers' goodwill or lack of goodwill. How can we create employment opportunities for ourselves such that we are not subject to stigma and discrimination? And what they arrived at was entrepreneurship. And then here comes legislation again. I should also mention the late Chuck Turner was a mentor of Aaron's, and was integral in the kind of doings of that organization, and that'll figure in a little later.
Nia, let me just.
Their first venture was actually alternative.
Oh, sorry about the lag. I just wanted to highlight something.
I'm with you, Andy.
Okay, I just want to highlight something that you landed on. We're having this conversation about being an ally and just social justice and racism and economic empowerment. And we're landing on entrepreneurship as a solution. I just want to highlight that because I've been at this stuff for a while, hopefully a long while more. And it's very recent that our cohort of lunatics doing this work that is, to try to bring about change is talking about business so much. And it is exciting because there was a paradigm for a very long time in progressive circles, in social justice circles, that business was the people you got money from and was usually just sort of this other. And what I have seen in your work and in Deborah, your work, is harnessing entrepreneurship as a tool of empowerment that is so obvious, and yet I had not heard it in the flow. Of course, it was out there. I hadn't heard it is the problem. What an incredible opportunity to bring people together around something.
And I appreciate
Go ahead.
I actually appreciate you. So I appreciate you highlighting that. And I'm working with this. I'm trying to close windows. I notoriously have a bunch of windows open. So I'm trying to get this bandwidth up. I appreciate you landing on that, Andy, because I think the thing that's notable about that is you're saying, wow, I had never thought of entrepreneurship. And I think it's important to point out who did. So the people who thought about entrepreneurship were the people who were experiencing the issues themselves, were the people who had the experience of being really hopeful about the potential of this legislation, and still not benefiting as was thought. So I think that's notable. So I actually appreciate you kind of stopping us there, because that's an important piece of Ujima's work. That's an important piece of BII's work, is understanding up until this point, there's been a bunch of untapped expertise, because we are informed, our perspectives are informed by our position. And so the members of BWA, being the ones who were experiencing that discrimination themselves, being the ones who were combating those barriers, they were the ones who said, this is what we want to do for ourselves. And so then I would say the work of a BII, and we'll get into what their role was, and the work of Aaron Tanaka, for example, and then ultimately the work of Ujima, was actually listening. And so you opened this with listening. The first step in that process was listening to what people were saying they wanted for themselves. I see you are you trying to get in, Deborah?
Yeah. Because I think it's a couple different things going on here that are worth teasing apart a little bit, which is, you know, one is who's saying I need to be an entrepreneur, and the other is why didn't we notice it as an area? And I think the issue is it's something that's inside the philanthropic mindset, which is in our economy, there are winners and losers, because we've designed an economy there where there are winners and losers, or people who have and people who don't have. And the way that we prop that up is by making sure that the people who have give some philanthropy to the people who don't have, or give them some jobs, and generally give them some entry-level jobs. And most of the work around economic development and work on behalf of communities of color has been jobs. It's been focused on income. And income does not solve the problem of generational wealth divide, And so when you ask the question of if we just focus on income and we use some community development and economic development, a little bit of policy and philanthropy, and we give people of color some jobs, and maybe some affordable housing that they don't own, then maybe we can solve the problem. And of course, it doesn't solve the problem. The problem gets bigger. And the issue that I think folks like Ujima, BII, and folks who've been left out of ownership are focused on is not jobs. It's not income, it's wealth, it's ownership. And more importantly, it's ownership and control over assets, which are buildings and land and the means of production, which is business. And so if I can control assets, then I can find my way out of poverty. And since the wealth holders leave just dribs and drabs for people who don't hold wealth, and mostly it's jobs, and it does not change. The racial wealth divide, I think we know, has not changed. It's the same as it was in 1968. We've made no progress, and inequality in this country is bigger than it ever has been. And so this is where people who've been left out know, I can't wait for somebody to do something with policy. I need to own and control. I need to create an enterprise. I need to build business for myself. We need to own. And people who've been maintaining the status quo through, and I want to say this as a person who was raised to practice tikkun olam, through philanthropy, through generosity, it's essential. But if it's not about the shift in ownership, control, and power, it doesn't change inequality in our society. And that's what I think Nia is trying to get at.
I love it because I'm making myself the example here. I came into this work authentically, but with such a tiny awareness of the range of choices for doing stuff. So being a lawyer was the obvious first one. Litigation. Then it was not litigation, it's policy. Then at some point, very late in my development of this, it occurs to me that self-determination and wealth and dignity and control, wait a minute, this was not hiding. And by the way, the people who are closest to the pain, as Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley has so gorgeously named it, have been starting their own businesses and trading and bartering and creating forever, not even in just this country, just forever. People are always resilient and resourceful, and that is the natural state of things. This inequity thing is what's been imposed upon that. So this is why I keep saying back to the future. What you got, this is what maybe I'm talking to myself, but what I find fascinating is that Ujima and the Boston Impact Initiative and so many others, because we're not just talking about organizations, we're talking about methods and thoughts. You're actually really old school. Radical is this word, right? Like new, different, fundamental, total change. You're actually arguing for like Jimmy Stewart type behavior.
No.
No.
Certainly cooperation and recognizing our interdependence. However, the reality, you cannot take the context away. And the context is that we've created a number of tools as a society that have generated the way thing, capital and resources flow or don't flow. And what's radical is that we're using those tools. We're using the tools that
Keep
were
going,
designed
keep going.
to create extraction and accumulation in the hands of the few at the expense of the many to redistribute and be reparative.
But you're
So yes,
relying on,
cooperative economics has been around, you know, you can look anywhere in the planet and you will find people who understand the nature of cooperation as an economic activity. Then colonialism and extraction and the accumulation of wealth and fiat-based or national currencies, et cetera, started to centralize and accumulate and hoard in the hands of the few. And so now we're saying, wow, we can actually wrap our arms around financial capital, financialization, which is this crazy modern thing. We can wrap our arms around financial capital and use it to be fundamentally redistributive. That's the new part.
I'm agreeing with you. I just meant that you're talking about human beings being in relationship and having the headspace and the time in the day to actually be creative and productive and self-reliant and successful, rather than having to be at the mercy of these forces that are such artifices that get imposed on and sort of get in the way of that cooperative behavior. But your localist angle is really something we haven't been able to bring out yet, Deborah, and I want to come back to that. But Nia, hold on one second with that. Nia, take us back. We don't have time to get the whole story from Cerro, but the part that's most important to me tonight is this. Do we have potential tonight to get people interested in using their social capital to get gigs for this company, business, and not just one-off like do-gooder things, but like to become their client? Like, you have an institution that has compost. These people will come and take it away forever, and you will pay them.
Yeah. So, yeah, and I'm trying to order my thoughts here. So what I think I'll do, just in response to that last question, and I do want to comment just on the previous discussion, but in response to that last question and just kind of tying it into you know, just what it means, yeah, to be an ally. I know there was a conversation about language in the first session, so do want to acknowledge. So there's kind of like the notion of ally, accomplice, co-conspirator. So they're for sure, and this is just in service of kind of raising the stakes, Andy. So I do just want to make sure I bring that in. And what I'll say, I think, is kind of for me in an umbrella term, would just be just working in solidarity with our communities. So just really trying to tie that in. So one of the things we did last week that was great, that was not planned. So we had a very loose structure. And so again, this comes out of creating a space for our businesses, our members, our investors to be in the same space as equals. And we really try to kind of challenge traditional kind of hierarchy and power, and really try to address power imbalances. But one of the things that came out of that, to answer your question, Andy, was one of our members asked, do you do compost for homes and for families? And that generated a great conversation, mostly in the chat, about different things that people can do. So to answer your question, the answer is yes. This isn't something that Cerro itself has focused on or currently focuses on. Their business-to-business business. They have large customers like supermarkets, universities, hospitals, et cetera. But this conversation that emerged in our conversation last week provided possibilities. So when we talked about what it looks like, for example, for families and for homeowners and for renters to consider Cerro, and to see how they make themselves clients, what emerged were ideas like, could there be neighborhood pickup locations? Because Cerro has to kind of operate on volume. So what they can't do, for example, is have a client that's a house on a block in one area, and then a client that's in another house on another block far away. So they have to think very carefully about their routes and their volumes. So anyone with that expertise, for example, I'm sure Sarah will welcome it. I see Deborah's unmuted herself so that she can talk about this piece as well. Again, neighborhood pickup locations became a solution that was tossed about. Deborah threw in the chat, maybe faith institutions could operate as neighborhood pickups. And so that's just an example. I'll pause there so that Deborah can respond as well.
No, just that. I mean, we were talking about like they can't do residential. So imagine if the congregants of a shul could say, I can drop my compost off on Thursdays or whatever at Vilna Shul, and Sarah will do a pickup. That, you know, or maybe make it Shabbat so that you're going there anyway. So anyway, there are ways to aggregate people, and the faith-based institutions have been really instrumental in that kind of partnership.
We also, though, have people on this meeting tonight and in the other ones who have a company where they work or an organization that they're part of. You know, I think you never know with Zoom whether it's their account or the person, but Princess Johnson is on, who's my old friend from Facing History, and they are a co-sponsor. But that's a great example when everyone's back in the building, God willing, not too long in the future. But maybe they're already doing composting. But that's a great example of an organization where, you know, okay, you know, who are they going to? Hey, it is Princess. If they, hopefully they are doing it, and if they are, you know, that's what gets interesting for me is, can we generate customers? And then what gets interesting for me for the customer is, what if you found out that it's a little more expensive? I don't know if it is, and they have to compete. The world that we live in requires it. But what if the customer knew that it might be a little more expensive to use a independent organization that's made a commitment to the principles that UJIMA and BII ask of them regarding what they pay, you know, how they treat their workers, where they source their materials from, and they're doing more of a real cost to you. You're purchasing impact. Are you ready to pay for it? That's exciting to me, and you can be a customer. Nia, take us to the rest of what you wanted to on Seto, and then I want to go back. Then I want to talk money. Like I have a couple questions for both of you about this. We've been throwing this word investment around, but I got to get into a couple pieces of it in a minute. But Nia, finish that out for us.
I'm definitely gonna try to move faster. But so before I do that, I want to comment on the previous conversation, because I appreciate your point, Andy, and I appreciate the nuance that you brought to it, Deborah. What I appreciate about your point, Andy, and I do think this is important, and this is definitely work that I would say we do very specifically on behalf of Black communities. And so we have a series called Black Trust, for example. That's one of the ways that we try to do this, and it gets at that history. And so the idea is to excavate that there is a history. And right now I'm talking about Black communities, but we know that there is this history in other communities as well, and it looks different ways in different communities, that there is this history of cooperation that has been terrorized out of us, and it has been literally terrorized out of Black people. Cooperation at one point, so certain types of cooperative economics and collectives were deemed illegal. Not a surprise. Reading at one point was illegal for us. So things that we created that were for our well-being as a function of white supremacy were attacked. And so there's work that we do in our own communities to uplift that and to say, to your point, this isn't new. So this isn't something that's completely fantastical that we regard as completely impossible. These are actually ways of being that we did know at one point, and they were beaten out of us. And because they were beaten out of us, they have become devalued. So because a lot of our ways of being in this country are demonized and villainized and devalued, a lot of our work is to say, let's unlearn that. Let's unlearn that devaluation. So I appreciate that, because I think there's a way in which being an ally or an accomplice or a co-conspirator, this notion of getting out of the way, to me, that ties to understand that what we may understand as tradition and convention is actually negative disruption. And so if we get out of the way, then we return in some ways, and Deborah's point about nuance is well taken, right? So it's not going back in time to some like romanticized past, but there is a way that we return to some ways of being that have been interrupted. And when we disrupt, so to speak, the interruption. So that's a quick comment I wanted to make on that. If I go back to the Settle story really quickly, and I'm gonna try to rush through it. So they said entrepreneurship. They started with a alternative fuel venture, flopped. And what they then knew, here comes legislation again. What I like about this story is the importance of communities being proactive. There was legislation that said companies that did more than 4 tons of waste would be required to compost. So they said, wonder if there's an entrepreneurship opportunity in this legislation that we know has passed. It's going to have to be enabled. It's going to have to be implemented. We can be a company that helps these companies, organizations, corporations be in compliance with this new law. And so Settle Co-op was born. Not surprisingly, people who face stigma and discrimination searching for employment also face that in trying to get traditional capital. And so then here's where we kind of now get to BII's work and Ujima's work. Aaron, by this point, is at BII. So here's what's great too, and I think this is important. So Aaron is now taking years of organizing experience. So his experience with BWA, his experience in college, he went to Harvard, by the way, if anybody's in Harvard, and he did a bunch of stuff with Philip Brooks' house on that campus. So he's now taking this organizing experience and he's now combining it with finance experience. I think that's a rare combination. I don't know if Deborah would agree. I think that's a rare combination. And so he's learning what he's learning at BII. He's now positioned to get the federal entrepreneurs capital that they would not have been able to access otherwise. And maybe Deborah, you want to step in at this point and tell that part of the story?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so an enterprise like this, so the story is they need to raise $1 million over 4 years, and they're starting at 0. They have no collateral. They have no personal savings. They have no credit history. So they are not lendable to. And yet when you look at, when you care about impact, when you care about closing the racial wealth divide, when you care about an ecologically responsible enterprise in the hands of communities, working class communities of color, Cerro is exactly the kind of enterprise that you want to support. So there are non-traditional folks. We're lucky in Boston. There are several of us. We were there, Boston Impact Initiative. The Cooperative Fund of New England was there. So a couple of us came together and said, we got to bet on an organization like this. And we're talking about making loans at 0% interest with no collateral, right? Then you're talking about their community organizers. So they did something very unusual. It's called a direct public offering. And so instead of an IPO, when a company goes public on the stock market, you go DPO, direct to the public. Small investors, people who are not wealthy, can put small amounts of capital, and they raised $340,000 that way. And so we were layering in capital in very non-traditional ways. And that layering of capital with people who said, I care most about this issue of inclusion and ecological stewardship. And these are the people that we need to support. And we can actually put some risk capital out there. So you layer grant capital and you layer 0% loans and you layer some community investing. And eventually you get to, 7 years down the road, something slightly more conventional in terms of investing. But there's a lot of risk. They got grants from a local foundation that said it's worth, making a first bet. So philanthropy followed by community investing, et cetera. It's layering these things in. And that's sort of what we call integrated capital or blended finance is part of the essential pathway when communities don't have what a bank would look for, when they don't have credit scores and they can't do personal guarantees and they don't have collateral, which is most small entrepreneurs. However, if you're an entrepreneur coming from a privileged background, you just go to your friends and family right? And so but in our city, which is so segregated, and y'all know, I'm sure, about the $8 of net worth for a Black household in the city, and segregation, you have your neighbors don't have friends and family dollars, your relatives, you can't go to the uncle, you're not necessarily able to go to your alumni networks. And so that $30,000 on average that a company needs to bootstrap their own enterprise doesn't exist. And then that's where we all come in, and that includes you all, right? There are ways to say, I can participate. You don't have to be a wealthy person who's like, I'm a high net worth person, I'm going to drop, $50,000 on this organization. Small contributions layered in allow an organization like this to launch.
Thank you, Deborah. And then just really quickly, and so I like to tell that story because there are two layers. So there's the types of money that Deborah talked about. There's impact investment, there's philanthropy, there's regular investment from community members, there's a sweat equity from the business owners. So there's the money, and then not surprisingly, there's who's providing the money. They're the multiple stakeholders. And so what Deborah talked about was essentially this group, BII, CFNE, the local foundation, community members, basically having a common stake and having a common goal and saying, as Deborah said, we want to bet on this business. So that's the other piece that we like to highlight is we have people from different walks of life, different actors, different stakeholders, different parts of our community who are pulling their resources, and part of those resources are their expertise, and they're saying, we're going to put this in service towards the creation of a venture. And then the other thing I just wanted to highlight when I talk about this combining of finance and organizing, also just want to point out our multidimensionality. So I think that's another thing we try to do with UGMA is to say, none of us are one thing. So, identity politics is always kind of a, fraught conversation in this country. We all occupy multiple identities. What we embrace is what we embrace. But the point being, we're multidimensional. So our tendency to pigeonhole different communities and to pigeonhole ourselves is limiting. So that's the other thing. Just want to point out in that process.
So, but one of the identities that is fraught for us as a country and is really familiar, and the Vilna Shul is emblematic of it, is immigration and migration. And so many of the worker owners that you're talking about, or potential worker owners, if there were financing for all of their brilliant ideas that they have that solve problems that they experience, is the immigrant communities, and they're everywhere. They're everywhere in this country, and again, will be soon if we start it being a place that people ought to want to move to from all around the world. So I love the way that this is identity politics in some ways, but it's really universal. Everyone's journey into success in this country can start with self-reliance if there's capital around putting an idea on wheels to go forward, and find its market. Brilliant. Deborah, you and I talked about something and you threw some jargon at me that I loved. And it's my new jargon crush. Full spectrum investing, I think. Can you say what that is again? Because I'm so old school about some of this stuff. Like I came from law and philanthropy. And now I'm like moving so far into different ways of thinking about things, but these norms are in our way, and so give me this new language new to me, and what does it mean for people who are thinking about how they might be of use here?
All right, I'm going to mess with you even more, right? Because there's an even bigger thing going on, which is we're moving from an age of duality, like this industrial, like right, wrong, good, bad, light, dark, whatever, to a complex universe where things live on a continuum, right? Think gender. Oh God, it's a continuum. Who knew? So sexuality, gender, all that. So capital's a continuum, but that's not how we relate to it. We relate to it like with my right hand, I'm gonna make as much money as I can. And that's gonna throw off a little excess. And with my left hand, I'm going to give it away to my favorite projects. That is the way we do philanthropy. Okay, so with the right hand, I'm going to maximize my return. I'm going to do private equity funds and hedge funds. I'm going to get an IRR of whatever, and 10x my money, whatever you want to think about over there. And I hope I do as well as I can. And I'm going to pick the best thing I can possibly invest in and hope that it crushes the competition so I can extract financial value. By the way, I'm going to do the same thing over here as a philanthropist. I'm going to pick the best social intervention I can. I'm going to have some metrics, and I'm going to hope that it scores really well and better than its class. Okay, so somewhere in between those two extremes is a capital continuum, and there's zero in the middle. So zero in the middle is, I'm going to lend you $10,000 at 0% interest, and you're going to give me 10,000 back. So I put my money out, I get my principal back, 0% return, but I get all my principal back. I invested in some, venture capital firm, and I expect my 10,000 to turn into 10 million someday. It does for people sometimes, right? So especially entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley, if they're white male. So that's what I'm hoping for at the far end. And then there's the rest of us who we get, 8% back, 12%, 3%, all in there. And we talk about regular investing, and then we talk about impact investing, which some people call concessionary investing. Concessionary means, as a conventional investor who's finance first, I expect to get 12% on this piece of debt, and an impact is less than that. So maybe I'm going to make a loan at 4%, and that's concessionary. It's concessionary if you think about the market and the fact that the market is designed to create inequality. It's concessionary to a market that's designed to create inequality. So maybe we shouldn't think of it that way. We should probably find another paradigm, which I could get into, but let me finish the spectrum thing.
Next time.
So there's zero to something big. Then we leap from zero to negative 100%. So I give you a $10,000 grant and I get negative 100% back on my money. And I've missed the fact that there's this whole world in between 0 and negative 100, where I get 8,000 back. That's 80% back. I get 2,000 back. That's 20%.
Because I call that losing money. But giving you 10 wasn't losing money. Giving you 10 was charitable donation. Giving you 10 and only getting 7 back means I got something bad must have happened.
Yeah, so we're going to change that, because now in this zero, first of all, I want people to really, we need to talk about the 0, 1, 2, 3, 4%. I want to talk about that too. But in this 0 to negative 100, I'm going to tell you why this is so important right now. COVID is a black swan event. Nobody expected it. Businesses are closing like crazy, especially if they're BIPOC owned, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and people of color owned, right? They're closing. And I can move money in such a way that I might get some of it back, but not all of it back. And now what I'm doing is I'm starting to share in the fate of the people that I'm in relationship with. So this is something we're doing right now. So instead of raising money where I'm going to sell you a $10,000 3-year 3% note, you're going to get 3% back on your money. I'm now going to say, you can give me a 0% recoverable grant. And I'm going to help entrepreneurs stay open. So I've got childcare companies in my portfolio. I've got all kinds of Cero-like companies that are fantastic and deserve to stay open. And you give me that money and I'm going to invest it in these companies. I'm going to give them they're getting a loan, or they're going to get some equity. It's a real capital structure. It's not a grant. I'm giving them money. They're going to pay me back. They might pay me in non-traditional ways. We could get into things like royalties and purchase order financing. That's too much. That's another time. So they're going to pay me back. If they pay me back in full, I pay you back in full. If they pay me back in part, I pay you back in part. And I'm a nonprofit, so I'm not taking any fee off of it. It's just trying to tie your money to the outcomes and the fate, good, bad, of other people that you live in community with. And that's the terrain of full spectrum capital on the negative side of zero, which means you are willing to put money out into the marketplace and you're willing to get less than 100% back. But by the way, if all you did was make a grant, you're not recycling it, and they may not even need the grant. What they need is somebody to take a risk on them and to be tied in with them around the risk. So that's the negative side. And I have a lot more to say about the 3-4%, but I'll pause
But
there.
what I know is happening is we're getting people interested in learning more, and we're going to hit 8:15 and say goodnight. So I want to say a couple things that are occurring to me as I look at the list of who's here, and forgive me, friends, because I don't know everyone on this list, but Barbara Burke is with us tonight, who's like the question I would want to ask her. Maybe she could answer in the chat, Barbara, if you're there, is public policy. Like what, and I would ask Nia and Deborah this as well, if you don't mind, just give us a short answer so we can cover a lot of ground. What do we need from the public policy world to help normalize some of these structures without messing them up? Letting them grow, giving you space to be organic, slow, deliberate, and special, not like wrecking it by, showing up and messing it up with imposing a framework on it. But what do we need from public policy?
I'll give you one, and it's very specific. So we need a lot more regulation of the extractive side of the spectrum. But the one that I want to say is actually for those of you who have enough resources to put money into a donor advised fund where it sits, you get the tax deduction when you put your money into it. It may sit at Combined Jewish Philanthropies or at the Boston Foundation, or are involved with a foundation or family office. The policy is people need to move their money way more than they move, meaning the 5% payout that foundations are required and the 0% payout that donor advised funds are required to make. So just what that means is you put that money into a donor advised fund, you have zero obligation to put it out into the world, which means the very money that the state is giving you a tax benefit on is sitting there tax advantaged, not going to the charities and organizations and activists it should be reaching. And so policy could change the payout. There's a big movement for that right now, and we could add those to the resource list about moving money. That's one.
Okay, Nia, give us one. That's awesome, Deborah. I'm not, this is where I have to interrupt, but that's rich, and we'll get the links to people. How about you, Nia? What about public policy? What is government supposed to do here to either get out of the way or get in a helping way?
Yeah, so I would say get in a helping way, and correct me if I'm wrong about this in Massachusetts, but I know Deborah, or anybody who would know better than me. But I don't think, for example, if we're just talking about cooperatives, I don't think there are a lot of states that make it easy for cooperatives to apply for different types of capital. So my understanding, for example, is Rhode Island had some state legislation, I want to say that passed a couple of years ago. So I would have to look it up, and I can provide that on the resource sheet. It was considered pretty landmark, again, because I think a lot of states don't make it easy. So a lot of cooperatives, for example, kind of run into some snags when it's time to talk to traditional banks, and when it's time to kind of look at collateral and that whole thing. So that's one thing I think of. The other thing that I'll say, and I'm not expert in this, but I did see it and I was like, ooh, that's interesting, is Urban Institute just put out a brief actually on community equity sharing. It features the Ujima Fund, it features 4 other initiatives. And in that brief, there's a tax credit that they talk about. So I just appreciate that Deborah is talking about tax policy here with a donor advised fund. It occurs to me that tax policy is probably a pretty rich area where we could see government either helping or where appropriate, not interfering negatively. And Deborah has written in the chat, local economy preservation funds.
That's another tool that could be huge that's being advocated for by a big coalition that we're involved with, which is it's mirroring something that happened in the 1930s, but where municipal or state and or federal dollars would be set aside to be holding companies for companies that are distressed due to COVID. And then when they're ready to come out of the holding company, they can only be resold to local BIPOC, so Black, Indigenous, people of color, entrepreneurs and co-ops. So it's a way of making sure that as when you're in a crisis in the economy like we are, that private equity and other buyers don't come in and buy discounted entrepreneurial assets and make them into national chains. You keep the ownership local and just. So it's a new tool. Yes, Democracy Collaborative. Many others are involved in that. And it's really exciting piece of legislation that may be coming.
Someone was asking also about public housing in the questions. It's the ultimate opposite of ownership, and you alluded to that, both of you. I think housing is obviously such a big issue. Getting people housing doesn't help them with the wealth piece, if particularly like in Massachusetts, home ownership is such a secret path to wealth. What should we be talking about in terms of public policy around that piece? Do you guys have each a favorite solution on that one?
I don't know about a favorite. So that's another area that's rich. So even kind of when we look at public housing, there are conversations about how tenants in public housing can have ownership of public housing. And so there are some initiatives, so kind of along the lines of, what's the thing? Kind of along the lines of, is it IDAs, accounts where you kind of set aside money and you're able to save, and then eventually you're kind of able to buy in ownership. So there are lots of those initiatives in public housing with apartments that are not necessarily public housing. And so for me, I think I would, if I had a favorite policy, I would just say, just like really expand the way home ownership can occur. It does not have to be kind of like a one family, one house situation. So another thing that has grown again, so that's older, that's kind of come back in vogue, is community land trust, for example. So that's another thing where we see home ownership being done differently. And then, I don't know how people feel about this. I am compelled, again, this goes back to tax policy, by the conversation about mortgage rate deductions. And the thing is, when you kind of talk about home ownership being the secret path to wealth, the mortgage tax deduction has been what has created that path. And so I know there have been conversations about eliminating that. I wouldn't necessarily say eliminate that, but I think there should just be more of a conversation that says, if we're giving homeowners these tax deductions, why can we not extend these tax deductions to different types of situations to, again, create additional paths to ownership with our homes, whatever those homes look like. So that's something I'm compelled by.
And I would just add, because I know, Andy, you like specificity, like we are in a really amazing community for land trusts, right? The Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, the Community Land Trust, the historic work that happened there. The Boston Neighborhood Community Land Trust is a really interesting experiment. There's the Chinatown Land Trust, a lot of community land trusts. And for those who aren't familiar, it means that while the building that the land sits on can be owned privately, the land itself is owned by the community land trust, and therefore the governing of it, the decision-making about how it's used, is controlled by the community. So it's an anti-gentrification tool, and it's essential, especially in a place like Boston, where everybody's been pushed out. The stuff that's just going on in Mattapan right now, the last place to take over for gentrification in the city. Those types of tools are essential, and these organizations are great ones to support and get involved with here in Boston.
And I see that, just really quickly, a couple more things. So I see Barbara Burke put minority purchasing objectives in the chat. So I'm just curious about that. And then just really quickly, the accompanying press to that Urban Institute brief, I can put that on the resource list. There's a Next City article about an organization called Nico, and I'm curious about what you think about this organization, Deborah. Because again, in the vein of just creating additional paths, this is an organization that allows residents to essentially have a stake in real estate development in the area. So again, it's not kind of one-to-one ratio in terms of I as an individual or my family unit owns this building, but what they've done is they've created ways for neighborhood residents to be able to actually buy into developments, for example, and have some equity. So again, I think there are just all sorts of interesting ways we can expand ownership.
That
And
brings us full circle to, sorry, Sandy, that full
Go ahead.
circle, what we're talking about with the integrated capital and the blended finance, which is what you do is you have, it's called, it could, different names, but a community investment trust, where you have a layer of, could be residents, could be local folks in the capital stack, and they own a share of what might be owned by, you know, a bank mortgage or others. And so that's part of, it's like a direct public offering in the case of real estate, where small investors pool their capital, they get into a layer, but they also have a say. And that's really critical, that there's a governing role alongside the capital role. So small amount of capital, but a large pool, and therefore having a right to have power over the disposition of the asset.
Power is a word we haven't used enough, and we're talking about it without talking about it, but without naming it. But at the end of the day, it's about power, but it isn't about it isn't about disrupting the natural state of things. I think the biggest piece of naive baggage that is part of white fragility is that somehow we're giving away something to people because we're supposed to feel bad that they lost in some sort of organic process that occurred in which someone had to lose. And that is to me, I'm not in this group, anyone who's still with us at this hour isn't necessarily on that train, but the majority of America does seem to be really on the fence about whether whoever it is out there that needs help, white, black, or immigrant or otherwise, really deserves it. And I think we're just, until we get off of that paradigm, we're tinkering. And that's why I admire these two women so enormously, because you're talking about fundamental change, and you're talking about not even change, Deborah. I'm going to take the risk of paraphrasing and synthesizing this off of your TED Talk that I watched this week, which I will put in the list too, about some of your ideas. But it isn't about changing it. It's about starting a different system that operates differently. It isn't about trying to maybe get the system to accommodate some of these ideas. It's about saying, just give us the space to build a totally different way, because that way is never going to yield to some of these natural things like self-reliance and power. Let me say, so Barbara Burke, who I called out, for those of you who haven't ever met Barbara, big part of some of the biggest and best ideas coming out of Mayor Menino and the city of Boston, and has worked in and around a lot of things, including IC these days. But Barbara was putting some ideas in the chat because we called her out about minority purchasing. The cities and state are doing some work to try to do more purchasing from BIPOC owned Black and Latino and women and other disadvantaged groups, businesses. And Barbara's also talking about how for these smaller businesses to get to compete on big contracts, they need very technical qualifications, including bonding capacity. Well, okay, but again, back to my thing about nature versus like all these artifices. Bonding capacity does not exist in nature. It's not like you were walking through the woods one day and saw that it found out you didn't have enough of that. We created that concept as, right, our organizations, our governments, our agencies. We set the limit ourselves. We can change it. It might have consequences because maybe it's risky. We know how to allocate risk. We know it all depends what we're solving for. If we are solving for self-determination and dignity and power, we can change the bonding requirements. The insurance industry knows how to solve that problem. We just have to ask them to. And the we sometimes is public policy, is a law or is a reg. Barbara's talking about a lot of other ideas we're going to share with you guys, because I know out there, a lot of you are saying, like, in the next legislative session, or is there going to be action on some of these things? But there's so much that can be done in the public sector, and we're all good at getting involved in those kind of advocacy campaigns. But what I'm so proud of about this conversation we've been having is we're also talking about things we can do as individuals. And one of them is reading and watching some videos and some talks. And getting smarter, getting more knowledge. The other is courage. We need to be ready to step out of our comfort zone, and not like tourism, not like, oh, let's go look at the, how the other people are, like, go there to be affected by it and changed by it and get involved in it and move money. Like, Barry Weissman is on, who I dragged into a committee to talk about getting some money moved. And he knows we barely got started so far, but we need to talk to families who have donor advised funds, families who make a lot of charitable contributions, not about lecturing them or scolding them, but about saying that goal you have, we can help you meet that goal, but there's a couple new ways to do it that are more respectful and have more durable results and outcomes. And be a customer. I'm so proud of the institutions that looked at Cero's offerings and didn't get freaked out by it and say, well, we're going to go with a more conservative, a more traditional, offering. That they said, okay, we're going to go with you guys. We got to do that at scale a lot. And I'm really proud of the Vilna Shul for letting us have these conversations, because we're going all over the place. If this was talk radio, we would have been canceled. But I hope we're provoking. So here's where I'm going to tell you to stay tuned, and I'm going to give my guests, my partner, Nia Evans, and my guest and co-opted partner, Deborah Frieze, the last word. But thank you, Vilna Shul, for saying, let's talk about these things. And even if we're not exactly sure what the shape of the outline is and what the script is, let's just get it going. Let's stay on it. Let's go deeper. Let's bring more voices in. And thank you. Thank you so much to the Vilna Shul for bringing us together. Thank you to all these incredible co-sponsors from all over town, from different Jewish organizations and others. Thank you to the Boston Ujima Project and all the courageous members who are stepping up and taking ownership of their situation, and to the Boston Impact Initiative, your funders, your investors, and the people who work with you. They could all go get hired at State Street any day of the week. They're doing something. So take us home however you two want to, and then we'll give it back to the Vilna team and to say goodnight.
Well, I want Nia to have the last word. So, so eloquent. So I think mine, I'm very pragmatic. So I think mine is like, find a buddy, tell your buddy what small action you want to take. And that small action is, I'm going to really look at moving my money in terms of where I bank. I'm going to look at moving my credit card. I'm going to look at I'm going to figure out some amount of investment. It could be really small. You could go on Kickstarter and make an investment, right? So like, some amount of money that doesn't scare you yet, to make an investment that puts the issue of addressing the racial wealth divide at the center. That's it. But find somebody, commit to it, and do it. Deadline, January 31st.
Oh, come on. That's way too long.
You wanted it to, no, because, COVID, bank selection, opening accounts. So I want y'all to move your banking, but especially if you're with one of the big Wall Street banks, look, we're not in Boston. We've got lots of banks you can choose from that actually do have a real commitment, as much as a bank can, okay, to addressing inequality in this community. So just find somebody, make a commitment for a small action. And then once you've done the action, close the feedback loop. What was it like? How did it feel? And what's my next one? Please do that.
Cool, Deborah. I think that's great, actually. So I really appreciate that. So what I'm going to say is double down on, I want to double down on that. And so I think what I'll add to that is do that first. What I have appreciated about this conversation all over the place as it was. I have appreciated some of the unpacking of what we're talking about. And so what I would say is after you've done that, because I wouldn't want the kind of deeper examination to get in the way of acting. So I appreciate that, Deborah, and maybe that's a change, right? It's kind of like I've got to kind of fret about this for a while before I move. So Deborah's saying move. I would say after that, then start the process of unpacking and examination, because I do think it's important to be critical of what we understand of our norms, which I appreciate you doing with us here in this conversation, Andy, because I think that's important for then I would say determining what the next steps are, what the deeper steps are, as you've said, Andy, raising the stakes. And I think as we kind of deepen our understanding of how we got here and of what underlies our conventions and our norms, then it becomes, I think, more and more clearer the steps that we have to take to undo some of this stuff. So that's what I would say. So how can you do that? We've already said before, come hang out with us. We try to provide a bunch of different ways to plug in. Deborah and I earlier this afternoon actually just started to kind of brainstorm on a couple of conversations we'll be having together next year that will be reminiscent of this conversation, but will go even further. So, kind of look forward to those at least two opportunities, for example, next year. So that's where I would leave it. I so appreciate that. Move first, take action. Once you've taken the action, then yeah, start to ask some questions, start to be critical, start to examine.
I'm gonna all I said was you get the last word. I'm gonna get the last two so that Marilyn knows it's back to her. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, everybody, really. I mean, it's been really enlightening. And I mean, there's just, I'm going to have to go back and listen to all this again. So many terminologies and personally, I realize how much I don't know. It's always good when you have an aha moment that you really don't know what you don't know. So we will figure out a way to continue this conversation. And certainly I look forward to the time when you guys can come in person to the Vilna and people can come and really talk some more about this. But I do appreciate that we need to find some small steps that everybody can do, that a layperson who's not in the thick of this can understand and really make one small difference. We know that it's not up to us to complete the task, but to do one small part is what we have to do. So thank you all. Stay well. It's been really nice meeting you all, and Deborah, nice meeting you, Nia. We hope that this is just the beginning of a friendship. And Andy, thanks a million for putting this together. We all have a lot to learn. I look forward to putting together the resource list, and we'll be reading and listening and learning going forward. So thanks again.